Okay, good afternoon, class. Now I'll be discussing the Kantian ethics. So, from the term itself, this ethics was formulated by Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher and one of the central Enlightenment thinkers whose comprehensive and systematic works in areas like epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics have made him as one of the most influential figures in modern Western philosophy. So, Kantian ethics refers to the deontological ethical theory, and it is based on the notion that it is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it. So, there is that concept of limitation. And those are considered good without limitation except the goodwill. Okay, so when we say deontology, it is a theory that suggests actions are good or bad according to a clear set of rules. Its name comes from the Greek word "jon," which means duty. So actions that obey the rules according to this perspective are ethical, while actions that are not going into the rules are not ethical. So comparing it with teleological, the deontological approach to ethics focus on rightness or wrongness of actions themselves without any other consideration, contrary to teleological, which approach ethics focusing on the rightness or wrongness of actions but based on its consequences or effect. Meanwhile, deontological approach this non-consequential theory. So there is no consideration as to consequences. It is not the basis in coming up with the outcome of the action. While those who are thinking of consequences would look at these outcomes as the basis whether or not an action is correct or wrong. For the teleological perspective, they see that it's not always possible to predict the consequences of the action. That's why it's the weakness of that approach. While under the deontological, it is rigid and objective, given that its focus is on the fulfillment of duty without consideration. So it's the rigid type and it's objective because there are already set of rules. So Kant's ethics is the study of our duty. And coming from that perspective, we can say that as human beings in this type of theory, we are seen as free and rational. But we get to choose between actions, not like non human animals who are guided by instinct. Moral actions are actions in which the reason leads rather than follows. So it's the reason as to the duty. And such actions must take into account other beings because we said that we are not just guided by instinct, but we look at the acts from the conception of the law, from the conscience, the free will. So simply put, to be moral in this perspective, we need to conform to our free will. And that is our duty. That is our obligations. And since it's under the concept of deontology, it perceives that the rightness or wrongness of actions themselves should be done without any other consideration. So the primary formulation of the Kant's ethics is called the categorical imperative. So when we say categorical imperative, we're actually looking at the four formulations. The universality, the treating humanity as an end in itself, the formula of autonomy, and the kingdom of ethics. So in here, Kant constructed the basis for the ethical law, as mentioned in the concept of duty. So the goodwill is unique because it always strives to maintain what is good in its moral value, even if it would fail to achieve the moral intention, because it does not look at the consequences and other consideration. So Kant regarded the goodwill as single moral principle, that your intention and your will is correct, and that is freely choosing to use the virtue for moral ends. So this goodwill is a broader conception than the will which acts from the duty. And this is not to say that acts are performed merely in accordance with duty, because there is also the need to highlight the special esteem to the given acts which you are performing out of duty. So you will understand more your duty the moment that you will really will for it. So when an agent performs an action from the duty, it is because there are rational incentives. You have thought of those, not just your instinct, as opposed to your mere inclination. So with the theory of Immanuel Kant, he wished to move beyond the concept of morality as an imposed duty and present these ethics as something that you really will. That's why there is a concept of the ethics of autonomy, in which the rational agents would freely recognize the claims. And these are the reasons that they really understand. So as mentioned, the categorical imperative is the primary formulation of Kant's ethics. And it is the distinction that Kant ethics had with other theories. So these imperatives are the moral binding in which you would base your reason rather than simply with the facts. So unlike other imperatives, which would only bind us insofar as we are part of the group or we are subscribing to the norms or culture, under this categorical imperative, we see that we cannot opt out from being rational agent, that it is our duty. So we owe a duty to rationality. So hindi pwede nga mapinalagpat or pag gusto ka lang all the time. But you really have to be rational as human being. You are expected to be a rational agent, higher than non-humans. So the rational moral principles apply to all of these agents at all times. So the first formulation is the concept of being universal. So when someone acts, it is according to the rule. Sometimes others would call it as the maxim, because for Kant, an act is only permissible if one is willing for the maxim or for the rule, and such would allow acts that will be accepted by everyone. So there is that universal law by which everyone are supposed to act. So sometimes maxim can also be immoral. And according to Kant, this happens when there is a contradiction with the universal law. So for Kant, morality is the objective law of reason. That's why it is called objective. So it's like as objective as the physical laws. We need to understand the rational laws and that are necessary before we act. So for him, a perfect rational being must also be perfectly rational. So we also have the second formulation, which is to treat humanity as an end in itself. So to act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means, that they deserve to be treated as human beings, that we must always be treated as the ends itself. That's why we also require that the own motives that we have should be equally respected. So a rational being cannot rationally consent to being used merely as a means to an end. So we're not here to be simply used. Then we have the formula of autonomy, in which Kant believed that any moral law motivated by the desire to fulfill some other interest would lead him to argue to his rational will. So this principle actually requires people to recognize the right of others. So the concept of autonomy is not really that you are free to do anything that you want, because you have to be mindful that as human beings, while we assert to our own rights, we also need to respect the rights of other people. So while we're claiming for autonomy, it's not really autonomous. So while we are wishing for universal acts and our intentions to be honored and respected, we have to be mindful that we are not just living alone and it's not just all about us. So we have to recognize the right of others to act in a manner that are also autonomous. And with that, we get to respect moral laws. And the last formulation, according to Kant, is the kingdom of ends. So, ano ni siya ang ends? So, according to Kant, a rational being must always regard himself as giving laws, either as member or as the sovereign of the kingdom of ends, in which we want to promote the freedom of will. So, this is actually the concept in which people are being seen to be individuals who have the obligation to act. So this is the context of the so-called duty in which this principle is guided. The people have obligation to act upon principles that the community in which there are other people who are also rational agents, and they accept those maxims as the law. So ginakonect niya ang three other formulation. So in such a community, each individual would only accept the maxim that can govern every member of the community. So it's the ideal, but we know that it is not easy. The actions of other people and events of nature would intervene, and their intentions would also intervene. And sometimes we know that there are bad intentions, there are bad laws. So that's where the conflict is coming from, according to Kantian ethics. Hence, we are still required to see things as the end itself. So it's the kingdom of ends, what it is that you are really trying to achieve. So having that understanding of the kingdom of ends, the outcome, not really consequence. So when we say imperative, it is a command. So it's a decision. And what's the connection between morality and categorical imperatives? So from this perspective, we can say that morality is based on categorical imperative. If you are to apply Kantian's ethics or Kant ethics, the reason is that morality happens because there is that sense of duty. You are commanded by it. And as such, you cannot opt out or claim that it does not apply to you because you are part of that universal law. So sometimes they would call the first formulation as the formula of universal law. Later, I'll be presenting some quotes in which we get to understand the context of Immanuel Kant in his words. Then, the second imperative is also known as the moral worth of the person. So, our moral worth. A person's actions determine the moral worth, but we know that there is more to this than merely seeing if the actions are right or wrong. That's why it goes beyond into asking what's the intention of it. Then we also look at the context that motivation is something that would matter in the end. Because moral worth only comes when you do something because you know that it is your duty according to this perspective, and you would do it regardless of the situation. So it's not also a perfect theory. We can see it from the explanation. But according to Kant, a good person is someone who will fulfill his duty. And the overall theme is that to be a good person, you must be good for goodness sake. The duty to be good. So here are 5 of his quotes as a way of ending this lecture so that we get to see his thoughts in a way that are not that abstract. So he said, do the right thing because it is right. He also said that you are to live your life as though your every act were to become a universal law. So the principle of universality or universal law. Dare to know, have the courage to use your own intelligence. So the duty to know why, the duty to understand the motivation of doing something, not just based on instinct. And he also said something in relation to animals, that if we are cruel to animals, it becomes hard for us to deal with people. And he said that we can judge the heart of man by the way he would treat animals. Then 2 things, according to him, awe him. First is that the starry sky above and the moral law within us. What it is that would guide us. It's amazing to talk about moral law, and it's also something that, although we're trying to digest it, is, for me, it's a personal experience to understand your moral law within you. Okay, so that's it, class, and I hope we get to understand the theory of Immanuel Kant and in relation to duty, in relation to morality, and how it is to be a good person. So lastly, according to him, we get to determine whether an action would violate the universal law if it is not in relation to the maxim, if it is something that we don't understand, the duty to understand. That's why there are imperfect duties and perfect duties. But it is the perfect duties or the duties of justice that can and should be appropriately be enforced by means of public laws, the duty of virtue. Okay, so I hope this somehow inspired us to will to be good person, because that also affects the entirety of our lives, and it also influence the quality of life of other people that we are surrounded with. So we get to inspire them as to our conviction to fulfill our duty. And may all of those duty are guided by proper motivation, correct means, and ethically correct ends. Okay, so thank you so much, class, and have a great day.